At 0742 on the morning of March 6, 1945, a new silhouette slid through the rubble of Cologne like a question mark. Cathedral spires pierced a gray sky. Streets were choked with masonry, twisted rails, and the ghostly mannequins of ruined shops. In the turret of that tank, Corporal Clarence Smooyer, 21 years old, wiry, steady, lay with his eye to the sight, listening for the small noises that tell a tanker more than any map. The cough of an engine 2 streets over, a whisper of foot traffic in a cellar, the metallic creak when a turret finds its bearing. The tank's magazine smelled faintly of oil and spent cordite. Outside, a city that had been a place of commerce and worship for centuries was now a maze of ambush lanes. They thought it was a German tank until it burned their best Panther. The line reads now, bold and sharp, the headline that would come to define what happened next. It's an arresting phrasing, and it leans on 2 truths. First, by early 1945, American Shermans had been outgunned across Europe. Their 75mm and, in many cases, inadequate frontal armor cost lives when they met Panthers and Tigers at range. Second, the tank in Smooyer's turret was new, rare, and unfamiliar to German crews. It was not literal invisibility that saved the day. It was confusion, an unfamiliar profile, a low, angular turret, and the fact that only a handful of these machines had crossed the Atlantic. The Germans hesitated. The Pershing itself was the result of years of debate. American armored doctrine had favored mobility and logistical ease. Shermans were reliable, plentiful, and easy to repair, which mattered in a war of supply lines. But that doctrine also left the force vulnerable when it met the heavier German designs. Engineers and commanders argued that what was needed was a tank with heavier armor and a gun capable of defeating the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers at combat ranges. That argument gained traction painfully slowly. The Pershing, officially the T-26 and later redesignated M-26, arrived only after decisive pressure from the front and from officers who had seen too many Shermans go up in smoke. The tank that rolled into Cologne in March 1945 had the kind of presence that matters in a fight. A 90mm gun that changed the calculus, thicker armor, a different turret shape. But it also came in such limited numbers, only about 20 in the European theater at the time, that many German tankers had never seen one. For them, in a city of rubble and fleeting shapes, the last thing they expected was an American tank that didn't look like the ordinary Sherman. That rarity is what the title leans on when it calls the Pershing secret. It was not cloaked, it was simply rare and unknown in the split-second, high-stakes recognition game of armored warfare. Major General Maurice Rose was one of the officers whose approval helped push the Pershing into the field.
The stories that circulated were the kind that became legend among armored men. A field test where the new gun muttered and then barked so differently from the Shermans that Rose and his staff felt the sheer electricity of potential. It is said that when the Pershing first fired for observers, the muzzle blast and the recoil convinced commanders in a way a chart could not. They had been measuring the wrong things on paper. What mattered was the confidence a crew could have when facing a Panther across an urban square. That human confidence, a heavy gun, a tougher armor scheme, mattered in the immediate arithmetic of survival. Still, a handful of Pershings does not a commodity of victory make. When Eagle Company's tank, call sign Eagle 7, prepared to enter the ruined streets of Cologne, it was a deliberate, risky choice to send a heavy vehicle into a city choked with rubble. The streets favored defenders. Angles of fire, covered approaches, basements and cellar exits that allowed anti-tank teams to move unseen. The Pershing was heavier and less nimble than the Shermans that usually took point. But that very heft and the long gun that sat in its turret made it the instrument the 3rd Armored needed to clear a path. Smooyer's crew in Eagle 7 had a shorthand born of training and the grinding necessity of survival. At the turret's ring, Staff Sergeant Robert Early commanded with a calm that could cut through static. Corporal John Derrigy worked the loader's chores with practiced precision. Private Homer Davis handled the assistant tasks that keep a turret running. Private William McVeigh kept the driver's station in proper tension with road speed and momentum. None of them expected celebrity. They expected ordnance, orders, and the odd, almost intimate terror that comes when metal and men try to negotiate fate in a single moment. The city presented its own geometry, narrow side streets that ran like veins off the main square, lateral alleys that could hide a gun with 10 seconds of exposure, buildings whose facades, once shelters, had become razors for shrapnel.
At around 0952, Eagle Company's lead elements encountered trouble near the square by the cathedral. Sherman's and F Company were hit, and the chaos of streets full of smoke and overturned vehicles made command and control brittle. Early decided to push a reconnaissance forward on foot to see if the hits were the result of concealed guns or a coordinated anti-tank trap. What the reconnaissance found was a weapon waiting in shadows, a Panther, planted in a knife point of urban geometry, its long 75mm gun oriented to dominate the square. Panthers were the go-to enemy of many a tanker's nightmares, a lethal combination of range and armor when engaged frontally.
But the Panther's strength was also a weakness in the city. Its long barrel could be a liability if the angle of approach forced it to expose its flanks, and the necessity to rotate its turret to track a flank trooper would cost valuable time. Early's plan was not daring for bravado, but precise in calculus. Rather than drive headlong into the square and present the Pershing's frontal armor to the Panther's gun, Eagle 7 would loop through a parallel side street, roll at speed around a corner, and present a moving target aimed to catch the Panther with its more vulnerable side. The hope? To force the Panther to rotate its turret, creating a half-second of indecision, and in that gap find a shot that could put it out of action. By 0958, Eagle 7 was staging for the maneuver. The engine growled differently under load. The tracks crunched over glass and mortar. Smooyer, in the gunner's position, felt every vibration as though the tank's bones were communicating strategy to him. He had trained for these moments in the flat fields of maneuvers, but a city was not a field. It had edges, echoes, and the way light caught on a turret face could mean the difference between being shot and shooting. When the Pershing rounded the corner, the moment compressed into a series of tiny decisions stretched taut. Oberlieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth commanded the Panther in the position that watched the square. He was, by all accounts, a professional who knew the value of a disciplined gun crew. But at the sight of a vehicle that did not fit their identification template, his crew paused. The Pershing's turret had an angular lower profile than the familiar Sherman silhouette, and in the flicker of street smoke and sun, it did not immediately register as enemy or friend. In a fight, hesitation is as lethal as fatigue. At 09:59:12, the timestamp preserved in film and memory, Smouyer's first round left the Pershing's barrel. It struck the Panther's side. The shell was armor-piercing. It hit, and the impact signature, a spray of spall and a metallic rasp, registered on the tank as more than damage. It was a message that this was not an ordinary opponent. Smooyer did not celebrate. He watched the sight, noted the way the Panther's crew shouted, and prepared for the next shot. 5 seconds later, at 09:59:17, the gun barked again. This time the round found a seam where side armor and turret met. Penetration took place. The Panther's tack of command began to unthread. Crew members moved to clear lines, access hatches opened with that peculiar clanking of metal on metal as men decided between staying and getting out. The urban acoustics caught the sound and threw it back like a witness. At 09:59:23, the third round arrived. The effect was immediate and merciless in its efficiency. Fuel or ammunition, the sources of catastrophe inside every tank, ignited, and a fire began that would burn long and render the vehicle inoperable.
Flames crawled and then roared. Secondary explosions danced like flecks in the heat. In less than a minute, the Panther had gone from a threat dominating the square to an object of ruin, its crew scrambling into the open, some of them surrendering, some of them running. Jim Bates, the Army Signal Corps cameraman who had been documenting the advance, had captured the whole sequence on 16mm film. Film does peculiar things to memory. It freezes a frame, and frames become evidence. They harden recollection into something that can be replayed for strangers. Bates' footage is jagged and grainy in places. It has the breathlessness of a human who filmed while the world fell apart. The camera's eye catches the flash of the muzzle, the bloom of smoke, the way dust throws itself into the air like a pale curtain. When editors and historians later parsed the film frame by frame, they found the timestamps and the sequence of hits that confirmed what Smooyer and his crew had always known in a way words could not. The Panther had been struck 3 times in a short span, and its destruction was visible evidence of a tank that could do what Sherman's had too often failed to do. But the killing of one armored vehicle does not make a clean victory. The square, witness to the brief drama, stayed dangerous for hours. The Panther burned and its ammunition cooked off repeatedly. Each detonation threw out new shrapnel and new risks for men who had to move in and clear the wreckage. Elsewhere, a Panzer IV, locked in the tangle of streets, was later buried when a nearby building collapsed after a U.S. high-explosive round struck its support. That collapse lodged the vehicle in masonry and silted a machine that had been a weapon into inert rubble. And there was the black staff car. It moved through the square under the same broken sky, an object of human life rather than mechanics. At some point in the maelstrom, a passenger in that car fell. Later, she would be identified as Katharina Esser. The precise chain of events that ended in her death could not be resolved with the certainty that men sometimes crave. The film shows a car, a flash, a person falling. But who fired the shot that severed the thread of that life? Was it machine gun fire from a Panzer IV? A ricochet? A fragment? A bullet whose origin would remain disputed? The historical record is careful here. It preserves the ambiguity. The duty of the narrator is to carry that ambiguity without collapsing it into a tidy conclusion. The geometry of urban warfare makes culpability a blurred thing. When buildings stand and fall, when ricochets and secondary detonations turn every corner into a mirror, locating the single source of a civilian death can be impossible. Soldiers and historians alike must live with that uncertainty, and men who survive live with the moral weight of it in ways that public records do not always capture.
For Smooyer, the scene print on Bates' reel would become a mirror into which he would look for the rest of his life. Back in the moment, the immediate operational task was simple and urgent. Secure the square, recover the wounded, clear the wrecks. Eagle 7's firing had removed the most immediate armored threat, but the city had other dangers, not least the human ones: confused defenders, frightened civilians, and the ricocheting ethics of combat, where bodies and rubble are indistinguishable at first glance. Smooyer's crew, like others, had to move past adrenaline into method, account for rounds expended, check the gun for bore obstructions, clear the crew compartment. They counted their own breathing like an accounting of lives spared. Jim Bates' footage did more than document firefight. It became, over time, a vector for memory. Screens and projectors took the scene out of the narrow river of that morning and placed it into a broader current of public understanding. For viewers decades later, the film offered a direct, if partial, portal to what had happened in precisely those seconds. For the men who had been in the turret, for the German survivors who saw their own burned tank on a newsreel, that same footage could act as corroboration or as an indictment, depending on who watched it and how they remembered. The Pershing's performance in that square carried technical meaning. It suggested to commanders and veterans alike that when doctrine and equipment finally met, lives could be saved, or at least a stand might be made. But the practical lesson did not erase what happened to the people who moved through the square afterward. A dead Panther is a tactical victory. A dead civilian is a moral wound whose edges keep changing. After the smoke thinned and the wreck cooled, men moved among the ruins and made lists. They loaded reports and took photographical evidence. They marked times: 095912, 095917, 095923, the precise seconds when rounds struck. Military reports would reference the engagement with that kind of mechanical neatness, and historians would later rely on those timestamps to map the flow of action. But for the men whose skin remembered the heat of the blast, and for the civilians whose world had been upended that morning, the tidy line of time did not do the emotional work. Time for them had a different axis, a before when the city had life, and an after when some names would be added to ledgers and others would haunt dreams. Smooyer, who had been in the gunner's seat, saw the tank burn and saw the people around it move in reaction. He watched as men climbed out and as the burning metal groaned in protest. He did not know in the split second the full human consequences beyond the visible. He did know the sound of the gun and the way the recoil felt through a shoulder. More than that, he carried the mechanical memory of doing his job well enough to take out a high-threat target.
But doing one thing well in a war does not inoculate a man against the moral questions that later arrive like creditors. The action in Cologne was over in terms of that particular armored duel, but the square's story was not finished. Soldiers cleared out of the area, medics treated the wounded as best they could under the circumstances, and the film reels were boxed and filed. The Pershing remained an object to be studied and understood: why the hits worked, how the crew had maneuvered, what the Germans could do to counter it next time. Engineers took measurements, and after the war, museums would accept metal priestly relics of a conflict that had been as much about technology as about the men who used it. Yet for those who had been there, the Pershing's small roll through a Cologne alley did not become only a piece of tactical history. It became something that would accrete meaning across decades, footage that would be replayed, a named civilian who would later be identified, a German gunner who would carry the memory of a burning vehicle, and a young American gunner who would wake in the dark years later with the smell of smoke in his throat. The
The technical victory was embedded in human cost, and the lines between them would not be easily erased. If you want more restored footage and untold World War II stories, subscribe. Even as the Pershing took its place in tactical studies, there were immediate practical considerations. A burning Panther could not be allowed to remain a hazard in the middle of a city square. Ammunition began to cook off. That ominous term meaning stored rounds within a tank's internal stowage began to detonate under heat, and each detonation threatened men and buildings nearby. Engineers and ordnance teams were called in to deal with the remains at a remove, to cool what could be cooled and to render inert what could not. Every moment a vehicle burned increased risk to civilians, to advancing infantry, and to the soldiers tasked with securing the area. There was another practical reality soldiers learned quickly in cities like Cologne. Rubble and collapsed buildings could swallow machines as readily as they swallowed lives. A Panzer IV, caught in the wrong street at the wrong moment, was damaged not just by a direct hit, but by a building collapse born of the blast of an HE salvo. A heavy round striking a load-bearing wall could free an avalanche of brick and beam that turned a functioning gun into a tomb of masonry. The image of armored vehicles half buried in rubble became in many ruined European cities a tableau of mechanized impotence, instruments of war reduced to stone. The human detail that historians circle back to with uneasy reverence is simple and terrible. Amid the metal and masonry, someone in a darkened car, moving through the square, fell and did not get back up. Her name, recorded years later, is Katharina Esser.
In the immediate moment, the car's movement and then the person's collapse were another element in the fog, a thing to note, a casualty to be documented. Over time, as Bates's film resurfaced in archival searches, and as survivors and witnesses sifted through footage, that single person became a focal point for questions that would not be comfortably resolved. Where bullets flew like small random weather in the square, whose bullet found her? Was it a jagged piece of metal from the Panther's cooking off, a defensive shot from a Panzer IV, or an accidental own fire from an American weapon? The historical archive preserves the not knowing as insistently as it preserves the knowing. In the moments after the engagement, the sounds of the city returned in inverse, slow pulses, men shouting orders, the rasp of sweeping brooms clearing glass, the muted conversations of medics. Soldiers did what soldiers do in the aftermath. They accounted for ammunition, they filed the logs that would become reports, and they tried to bottleneck their own emotions into rational descriptions. Smooyer and his crew sat with the residue of what had happened. They had performed a maneuver that had worked. The skies over the cathedral were the same pallid gray. But what they had done would not stay a tactical datum. It would become a memory with edges sharp enough to cut. The film would travel. Jim Bates's footage, once processed and cataloged, would be folded into newsreels and archival reels, and used by historians not just to establish the mechanical facts of the engagement, but to feel the moment, to watch the split-second hesitations and the cascade of consequences. For viewers decades later, those seconds were a portal, an American tank that looked unfamiliar, a Panther that went from dominance to ruin, a black car and a person who fell. For the veterans and survivors, though, the imagery would have a different gravity. What the film showed publicly, men and women who had been there felt privately in the slow hours of reflection that come after war. It is in that private sphere that the story moves from the tactical to the moral. For the men in the Pershing, the immediate reaction was relief and the mechanical checking of a vehicle after firing. For many of them, there would be later sleepless nights. The real would be a thing to be hidden in drawers, and a thing to be found decades on. For the German crews who watched their burned tank on newsreels, it became a point of rupture between how they had fought and what their losses had cost them. And for the civilians, the unnamed and the later identified, the square's story would become personal, and for some, fatal. Even at the moment, the city itself claimed its own form of testimony. The cathedral spire stood in the background as though indifferent to the human dramas beneath it. Its centuries of history made the action in the square look at once transient and obscene.
Men would later return to that spire as a marker in memory, a place to stand and measure what war had done. But in the seconds of the firefight, the spire was a backdrop to the larger narrative that armored warfare had finally met a machine that could, in the right hands, answer the Panther's threat. By the late morning, the Pershing had proved, in concrete terms, that its 90mm gun could do the work tactical doctrine had promised.
But that proof came at the cost of a burned enemy, injured men, a buried Panzer IV, and a civilian death that would knot the conscience of witnesses for decades. The scene in Cologne had technical consequences that would ripple through armored studies. Lessons to be learned about gun placement, about the value of a heavy tank in urban combat, about the cost-benefit analysis of sending heavier but less maneuverable vehicles into built-up areas. It also had human consequences that would not be so tightly plotted on a graph. The Pershing, rare and unfamiliar, had appeared in a city of rubble, and for a fleeting and fatal second, it was not clearly recognized. That hesitation in a Panther crew, a half-second of misidentification, is the fragile hinge upon which this story turned. It would later be described in tactical manuals and told in veteran halls as a demonstration of what equipment can do when it finally matches mission need. But for Corporal Clarence Smooyer, for the men who climbed out of a burning tank, and for the woman who lay in the street, it would remain an event that exacted a personal bill in ways no after-action report could ever itemize. The film, the timestamps, the burned metal, they form a clean narrative if you look only at them. But war is rarely contained by neat timestamps. It flows forward into lives altered by its blunt angles. The Pershing's presence in the square was as much a technical statement as a human event. The rest of what that day produced, the long wake of memory, the decades of questions, the attempts at reconciliation, would take shape slowly and unevenly. In the short term, men documented what happened, noted the times, and prepared to move on. In the long term, the footage would become a catalyst for memory and inquiry, and the men who had been there would have to reckon with what they had done and what remained unanswerable. For now, in March of 1945, the Pershing sat among the ruins and the cathedral spire watched. Men checked their gear and took a breath that was not yet the beginning of relief. They filed the report. They took the film can and labeled it with a time and a place. They did not yet know how often that reel would be shown, or how many times the name of a woman who fell in a black car would be spoken aloud decades later. They could not yet see the way memory would fold this one skirmish into larger arguments about equipment, doctrine, and responsibility.
They had done a crucial, narrow thing. They had survived an encounter that might once not have been survivable in a Sherman. But even victory held its own cost. The square was still a place of sorrow, and that sorrow would not be easily closed. Share this story to keep the names Smooyer, Esser, Schaefer from disappearing, and to remember the human cost behind the machines. After the reports were filed and the wreckage photographed, the Pershing's crew moved on to the tasks the Army gives men after a fight: inventory, maintenance, movement. The heat of the burning Panther had long since cooled to a memory of metal smell in their clothes. The square remained a scarred place with smoke streaking into the pale March sky. Men measured what had happened with the tools available to them: maps, timesheets, film frames. The military archive kept its ledger: 09-59-12. 09-59-17, 09-59-23. Engineers measured penetration angles. Ordnance officers cataloged rounds found and rounds fired. Jim Bates' 16mm negative went into a canister marked for processing, a small cylinder of emulsion that would, in time, carry the day's impossibilities into other people's living rooms. For Corporal Clarence Smooyer and many others, the ledger could not fold the moral residue into neat columns. The event that had unfolded in the square in Cologne came to occupy two lives at once, one technical, one personal. Technically, the Pershing had answered a long-argued deficiency in American armor doctrine. The 90mm gun and the more robust armor profile had proven their worth against an opponent that had been killing Shermans for months. The tactical lesson was clear and would be cataloged in after-action reports and later studies. Practically, however, the square had also become the locus of a human calculus that data could not resolve: who had been hit, who had died, and how many nights would men sleep with that day claying behind their eyes. Smooyer returned to a United States still processing victory and loss in uneven measure. He went home to family and to routine duties, and like thousands of other veterans, he did his best to fit the memory of war into a life that demanded other skills. But the images from the film and from his own memory did not sit politely in a trunk. They pushed outward. Nights were the hardest. He began to wake with the sound of muzzle blast echoing in rooms where no guns lived. He described, later in interviews and in letters, the smell of smoke touching at odd hours, the way the light of a kitchen lamp could bend across a tabletop and, for a breath, become the flash of a barrel. Those were not invented memories.
They were the after effects recorded and recounted in the way service members often recount war, as sensory fragments that, stitched together, make a continuous wound. The film that had recorded the engagement stayed quiet in archives for decades.
Jim Bates' camera work, originally another administrative artifact of war, gained new life as archivists and historians began to re-examine footage in the 1990s. In 1996, during an archival review and restoration project, the Bates reel was pulled and processed. Grain that had been left raw by wartime haste was cleaned and digitized. Historians and journalists began to parse the footage frame by frame. The images were not only visual evidence of an armored duel, they were a new way for a public and for veterans to look back at that day. When researchers turned close attention to the sequence, the black staff car and the woman who fell from it came into sharper focus. Using a combination of the film, municipal records, and later family interviews, investigators identified the passenger as Katharina Esser. The film never answered the crucial question, whose round had struck her, but it made the loss a named human tragedy rather than an anonymous line in a casualty report. That naming turned a fragment of film into moral pressure. For men like Smooyer, the identification reopened questions that had been lodged in memory but not yet fully formed into grief with a name. Across the Cold War years and into the slow unspooling of late 20th century memory work, veterans and survivors returned to old frames to seek context. For some Germans, the film became a proof of loss. For others, it became a spur to reconcile memory with history. Gustav Schaefer, a Panzer IV gunner who had been in the vicinity that morning and who survived the war, watched the footage years later and took from it a terrible possibility that the woman in the black car might have been hit by fire from his sector, perhaps even by a shot he had fired. He interviewed the footage and his memory and emerged convinced, though not certain, he had a moral stake in the death. He carried that conviction into the post-war decades as a form of private penance. The path from film to forgiveness is not direct. It took time and intermediary acts, letters, phone calls, mediated meetings, before a meeting could be arranged between men who had once been on opposite sides of the gun line. In 2013, Clarence Smooyer traveled to Cologne to see the square again and to participate in a small, fragile reconciliation with Gustav Schaefer. The meeting was not an exoneration. It was a mutual acknowledgement of how war knit strangers together in loss. At the graveside of Katharina Esser, the two men stood with families and with journalists watching. They did not claim to have solved the forensic puzzle of the fatal shot. They did, however, engage in an act that had deep symbolic meaning. Both placed yellow roses on the grave. The gesture was deliberately simple. Yellow roses chosen for their brightness and for the human signal they carried in that moment. Yellow blooms do not speak to victory. They speak to remembrance and sometimes to apology. For Smooyer, the act was a public facing of a private wound. For Schaefer, it was an attempt at atonement for what he had long suspected. For onlookers, including family members and the genealogy researchers who had helped identify Esser, the image of former enemies placing flowers on the grave of a civilian was a compressed lesson. That responsibility in war is diffuse, and that the human cost often binds the living into slow rituals of remembrance. Reconciliation did not erase the past, it shifted its weight. Smooyer spoke afterward of relief and of continued questions. Schaefer admitted that a lifetime of suspicion about a single shot had been desperate company. Family members of Esser took comfort in the fact that her grave had been tended and that the story had not been left to rot in anonymity. Journalists and historians used the meeting to ask wider questions about how civilians became caught in the crossfire in urban combat, and about the ethical obligations of armies operating where the line between combatant and non-combatant is porous. On the broader military and technological plane, the Pershing's role in Cologne had a ripple effect. The tank was not produced in numbers sufficient to overturn armored doctrine overnight, but its performance in that engagement and in several others later in the spring of 1945 lent weight to the argument that American armor needed a heavier variant. Technicians and doctrine writers took notes. Post-war armored development incorporated lessons learned from those March days. Pershings were shipped back for study. Museums later displayed preserved hulls and turrets, and curricula in armored schools examined the geometry of the Cologne maneuver as a case study in urban tank tactics, how a heavier gun, used with precise maneuvering and a measure of audacity, could compensate for the kind of tactical disadvantages Shermans had suffered in open country. Major General Maurice Rose, the officer whose early enthusiasm for the Pershing had helped push it into service, did not live long after the tank's first battlefield appearances. He was killed in action later in March 1945, a loss that became part of the larger ledger of American officers who paid with their lives as the Allies closed in on the heart of Germany. Rose's endorsement of the Pershing, however, had matter of record weight. His field assessment and the vivid story of the new gun's test fire carried influence even in absence.
The footage's persistence in public circulation shaped how later generations came to visualize the encounter, not merely as a tactical episode, but as a precise, replayable story that made abstract concepts vivid. That vividness brought both clarity and burden. Clarity because a visual record made the tactical sequence plain in ways that textual description could not. Burden because film freezes moments that are full of ambiguity. A camera can show a person falling from a car, but it cannot always show the precise chain of ballistic causation that led to that fall. The film emphasized what could be seen, and by doing so, sharpened unanswered questions that would haunt those involved. The decades that followed the war saw Smooyer become a participant in a slow commerce of memory. He attended reunions and spoke at veteran gatherings. He received interviews from historians and allowed his name to be associated with the frames from Bates' reel. He also carried the quiet weight of nights spent awake. In those public settings, he spoke with candor about the technical side of the engagement and about the human cost. He never claimed moral certainty about the fate of Katharina Esser. He insisted, as many veterans do, on the distinction between duty accomplished and moral absolution. His testimony became part of the broader archive that allows historians to approach questions of urban combat with nuance: how armor performs, how split-second recognition decisions cost lives, how civilians become statistical and then painfully particular. In 2019, the U.S. Army awarded Smooyer a Bronze Star for his service in World War II. The decoration was a belated recognition that carried emotional weight precisely because it arrived so many years after the fact. For Smooyer, the medal was not a cure for the memories he kept. It was instead a public acknowledgement of a role he had played in a fight judged by his country to have been necessary. Honors can tidy public record. They cannot, however, recompose the private ledger of sleep and remorse. Still, the Bronze Star provided a ritual of national thanks that contrasted with the private, ongoing rituals of mourning that the men of Eagle 7 practiced in quieter places. The story of the Cologne engagement and the images of the Pershing continued to instruct. Armored officers teaching doctrine in the post-war decades would point to the Pershing's performance as a reason to give weight to the balance between mobility, armor, and firepower. But the same instructors also carried cautionary notes about urban warfare. Heavier tanks can dominate in firepower, but are vulnerable to the vertical geometry of cities and to the ethical impossibility of insulating civilian life from combat's edges. That dual lesson, technical and moral, became part of curriculum and conversation. Smouyer's later years were marked by a slow weaving of personal peace and unresolved grief.
He married, raised a family, and lived in the shadow of the cameras that had once captured his hands on a gun sight. He received letters from people who had seen Bates footage and from relatives of the dead, some angry, some seeking reconciliation, some simply wanting to understand. He replied when he could and attended memorials when invited. The meeting in 2013 with Gustav Schaefer, public and documented, was one of several steps in a process of recognition that moved beyond litigation of blame toward an acknowledgement of shared damage. That shared damage is the hard center of the story. Film and bronze medals are external markers. What lingers is the ethical question of how war adjudicates responsibility when its effects spread in ways no soldier, planner, or historian can fully map. The death of Katharina Esser remained an unresolved node. Historians and participants alike accepted that the archival record would not close the question of whose shot had struck her. But the act of naming and the acts of remembrance, roses at the grave, public meetings, careful archival preservation, did something else. They transformed an indeterminate casualty statistic into a life that could be mourned, thereby humanizing what would otherwise remain a faceless number. In museums today, a Pershing hall sits behind glass and placards. Visitors read descriptions of armor thickness and gun caliber. Children are pointed towards scaled models. Scholars take measurements and write papers. The medal is inert now, a historical artifact that invites curiosity and technical scrutiny.
The story of Eagle 7's engagement in Cologne sits alongside that medal in museum texts, a cautionary tale and an illustration. Standing before the exhibit, a viewer can trace the arc the Pershing participated in, from doctrinal debate to first contact in Europe, from the test range to the Dresden of urban combat, and finally to the slow, human work of remembrance. Jim Bates's footage still circulates in mediatheks and online archives. It gets used in documentaries that explain tactics and in programs that humanize war by focusing on named actors and victims. The frames function both as lessons and as provocations. They invite viewers to ask what it means to fire a weapon in a city where civilians are present, to wonder what the cost of technological advantage is when technologies and people interact in the messy geography of streets and spires. The final years of Clarence Smooyer's life were marked by recognition and by a continuing wrestling with conscience. In 2019, the Bronze Star reiterated what decades of historians and fellow veterans had already acknowledged, that his role in the Pershing crew had been consequential on the tactical level. Yet the medal did not and could not answer the moral questions that had been posed by the sight of a woman falling from a car. Smooyer died in 2022.
Obituaries noted his service, the film that had carried his name into public record, and the late-life honors. They also mentioned, with the quiet respect such notices require, the other threads of the story, the civilian casualty, the decades of reflection, and the 2013 meeting with Gustav Schaefer. History often proceeds by compressing complication into demonstrable facts: who fired, what was hit, what the strategic consequence was. But the Cologne Square resists that compression. It sits instead as a knot where technology and fate, skill and chance, doctrine and individual action intersected. The Pershing's unfamiliar armor and turret profile, its rare and therefore secret presence in the European theater, produced a hesitation in a Panther crew that, for a few crucial seconds, altered the geometry of survival. That hesitation and the Pershing's gunfire changed the immediate tactical outcome. What the battle also changed, in ways slower and less measurable, was the emotional architectures of the men who had been there, and of the families and communities who lost someone in the crossfire. Looking back at the image of the burning Panther under the cathedral spire, one can see how quickly technology can shift outcomes in war. One can also see how slowly ethical meaning accrues to those outcomes. Soldiers do the job they are trained to do. Societies later sort through the consequences. The Pershing's performance in Cologne entered tactical history as evidence that American armor could match the German threat when given the appropriate balance of firepower and protection. But the enduring image is not a technical diagram. It is the black car, the falling passenger, the men at a graveside with yellow roses. Those images force a wider question. How does a society remember, compensate for, and forgive the unintended harms of its wars? The answer, partially, lies in the rituals erected in the decades after: medals and memorials, film restoration and academic analysis, and, crucially, human encounters that attempt to stitch empathy across former battle lines. When Clarence Smooyer and Gustav Schaefer stood together at Katharina Esser's grave and placed roses, they enacted one of those small symbolic acts that do not undo the past, but that reframe it. They made visible the fact that accountability in war is not always singular. It is often distributed, shared, and ambiguous. The Pershing never became a magical instrument that eliminated the human toll of tank warfare. It became instead part of a technological progression that saved lives in some contexts and still left civilians vulnerable in others. That complexity resists tidy lessons. Military institutions learned from the tank's performance. Families and communities learned the harder lessons about how fragile non-combatant life is in built-up battle spaces.
Memory work, through film, through graveside rituals, through historical scholarship, turned an instantaneous event into a long conversation about responsibility, recognition, and reconciliation. Watching Bates footage today, few viewers can avoid a double reaction: admiration for the technical seam the Pershing provided against a lethal enemy, and sorrow for the civilian caught in the machine of war. The two responses are not in contradiction. They are, rather, part of the truth the square laid bare: that technological success in war carries moral weights that must be named. Names anchor memory. Clarence Smooyer became part of the name line. So did Katharina Esser and Gustav Schaefer. They are not tokens. They are people whose fates intersected in a narrow corridor of history. To remember them is to refuse the anesthetic that numerical abstraction makes possible. It is to insist that behind any account of weapon systems and doctrine,
there are lives that were altered irrevocably. History will keep the technical lessons, tactics, armor thickness, gun calibers, and it should. But if the Pershing story is to mean more than a case study in a manual, it must also be carried forward as a human story, of hesitation that cost a crew, of a woman whose death could not be precisely traced to a single shooter, of two veterans who, decades later, folded grief and accountability into a quiet act of remembrance. Museums, archives, and classrooms will continue to teach the Pershing's tactical value. Graveyards and quiet morning visits will continue to teach the other lesson, that memory is not merely for the dead, but for the living who must bear the consequences of what history has asked them to do. That is why, even as historians write and students study, the small acts of remembrance matter. Each yellow rose placed at a grave, each frame of Jim Bates' film preserved and contextualized, each veteran's voice recorded in an oral history. These are the stitches that keep the broader narrative sewn to the human center it otherwise risks losing. The Pershing's rare presence in Europe, the secret quality in the sense of rarity and unfamiliarity, did what machines do in combat. It changed probabilities. What it could not do was change the fact that machines act through human hands, and that every strike reverberates through lives in ways that outlast tactical victory. The square in Cologne remains, in the archive and in memory, a lesson in that duality. Technology and tactics matter. So does the care with which societies remember the civilians caught in the crossfire. The Pershing's single, rare silhouette on that March morning created a half-second of recognition that altered fate in the square. The rest of what followed, the burning metal, the buried Panzer IV, the woman in the car, the decades of nightmares and of reconciliation, reminds us that the history of weapons cannot be disentangled from the history of people.
If this story moved you, remember these names: Smooyer, Esser, Schaefer, and carry them forward. Share this account so their memories remain visible, and tell others where you're watching from. Memory grows when it is shared.